This is PD World. I am Syed Shabahat Ali, and you are watching Fault Lines. The border dispute between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan took place once again last week. This time, the issue only continued for 48 hours before both the presidents shook hands and subsided the issue. But many analysts around the world believe that there is a lot of turmoil hidden underneath in the issue of Central Asian republics. And not only this is aggravating over a period of time, but also if Russia's influence keep going down in the region due to the war in Ukraine, this might give birth to many other problems in the region. That includes the countries like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. The irony is that not only Russia, but there are many other international players that have a lot of interest in this region. Why all of this has happened? What are the various dynamics of this dispute? Was it only a border dispute or something far more serious than that? All of this in today's program. Our team has prepared a package. Watch the package before I bring my first guest to the program.
Kyrgyz and Tajik border guards have exchanged fire after a dispute over the border between the two Central Asian nations. The Tajik side said in a statement that Kyrgyz border guards opened unprovoked gun and mortar fire on their outpost, killing one border guard and injuring another two. Kyrgyzstan did not immediately report any casualties. More than a third of the two countries' 1,000-kilometer border remains disputed. Both Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are allied with Russia and host Russian military bases, but fighting over border issues is frequent, and last year almost resulted in an all-out war between the former Soviet republics. In phone calls with leaders of Central Asian nations, Putin also urged them to take steps to resolve the situation as soon as possible by exclusively peaceful, political and diplomatic means. Both former Soviet Union countries are now part of the Russia-led Collective Security Treaty Organization, but they regularly have escalating tensions. United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres called on the leadership of both sides to engage in dialogue for a lasting ceasefire. The Kyrgyz authorities issued a statement saying the situation at the border remains calm, trending towards stabilization. Unprecedented clashes between the two countries happened in 2021, killing at least 50 people and raising fears of a wider conflict.
My first guest in the program is from Washington, D.C., Eugene Chowsowski, who's senior researcher at Newsline Institute. Eugene, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Shabahat.
What has happened between the two sides, Eugene? What is the real issue? Do you believe this to be a minor dispute or something serious than that?
So this conflict between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, it's not a new development. We've seen actually a number of these border flare-ups happen from time to time, really going back to the early post-Soviet period due to poorly demarcated borders and fights over territory and water, things of that nature. So in that sense, it's not a particularly new development, but the scale of it is somewhat larger than what we're used to in terms of having, dozens and into the hundreds of people injured. So in that sense, it is a concerning development, but still within the framework of what we've seen happen over the past few decades or so.
Eugene, you said it's something more serious. How serious exactly do you think this can become in future?
So it was certainly more serious, but I think it still falls within the threshold of a localized conflict, one between essentially the local border forces of these countries and the local populations. We have seen from time to time, more rarely, but if the situation escalates to a certain degree, that it could trigger Russian involvement, because keep in mind that both Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are members of the Russian-led CSTO military organization. They both have Russian troops within their countries in Russian bases. And so if it were to escalate to a very significant degree to the point of threatening the governments of these countries or escalating to full-scale conflict, we would see more Russian involvement than we currently are right now. That has been limited largely to a diplomatic and mediation and calls for ends to violence.
But Eugene, the military hold of Russia is extremely strong, as you said earlier.
That is the case, yes, especially in these two countries in particular. These are the most, I would say, pro-Russian or Russian-aligned countries in Central Asia, in that they have, as we've already discussed, Russian troops that are on their territory. These are troops that have been there for essentially since the collapse of the Soviet Union in bases, and they regularly coordinate and exercise militarily via the CSTO. So in that sense, these are very much aligned countries with Russia, primarily seeing Moscow as their ultimate security guarantors from other potential enemies and foreign powers.
Eugene, let's talk about the political setup of the two countries. I mean, are these really democracies or authoritarian states, as the case is in most of the countries of Central Asia?
So I think what you mentioned very much applies to Tajikistan, because it is a very centralized country with a very powerful president in Emomali Rahman, who's ruled the country for more than 20 years, ever since the civil war happened in Tajikistan early in the 90s. And so it is a very authoritarian country and very centralized. Kyrgyzstan is a little bit different. It's probably the most decentralized or relatively democratic country in Central Asia. And I use that term relatively on purpose, in that it does still have a very powerful executive, especially since Japarov came to power. There have been several revolutions that have occurred in Kyrgyzstan because it's a relatively free country where protests are allowed. But it's still, within the broader scheme of things, these are very kind of top-down and Soviet-style or post-Soviet style governments, in which the leadership has a lot of power and opposition is very difficult, whether that's formally or informally, to take place.
Eugene, the role of Russia in the region is under discussion at the moment. It reminds me of the fact that in Ukraine, there was also a tendency, there was also a tide in public who were increasingly getting more pro-Western, and there was a sentiment being generated against Russia, which finally and eventually resulted in a full-scale war between the two sides. Do you believe such a tendency might prevail in different parts of Central Asia with some time passing by?
Yeah, so I think that this analogy with Ukraine is a very interesting one. However, I would say that countries like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan and Central Asia in general, there's some key differences here. So geographically, these countries are much farther away from Europe than Ukraine is, which is essentially on the doorstep. And Ukraine had a lot of, European-style appetite for liberal democracy that I don't think exists nearly to the same extent in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And so the civil society is not as developed as it was in Ukraine. So even though that Ukraine had a pro-Russian president and government, there was a lot of opposition to this type of government that ended up overthrowing it in the Ukrainian case. I don't think those same conditions can be extended to Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Certainly there are some pro-democracy groups that want to see changes in government, but these are not necessarily Western-aligned countries or countries that have much appetite for that kind of government.
Eugene, at a briefing for diplomatic mission and press on September 19, Tajik Deputy Foreign Minister Sadiq Imami implored international organizations and foreign donors not to engage in water management programs with Kyrgyzstan without Tajikistan's consent. Now, why this is so concerning? Why are the two countries so concerned about the water management? Is there a problem? Is water one of the major reasons why both the countries of Central Asia have locked horns with each other?
Sure. So water disputes has been a really recurring feature within Central Asia for a long time. We've seen disputes over the management of water, with Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan being these upstream countries that have the river flow, but a lot of the times they will try to divert such water flows for their own purposes, and this can really create some conflicts. So this is something that the Central Asian countries have tried to manage diplomatically, but in a local context, it does tend to flare up and lead to clashes, not only over water, but over land usage and things of that nature. So this is a recurring theme that does tend to breed to conflict in this region.
Eugene, another important question that arises out of the conversation that we are having is regarding the Grono-Badakhshan region. where last year some military operation was done, some people were arrested. Now, how does this integrate into the picture that we are discussing at the moment?
So this is another reflection of the complex geography of this region, which I think does exacerbate some of the political issues that we've been talking about. Tajikistan is a largely mountainous country, and going back to its civil war back in the 90s, this Gorno-Badakhshan region was really the stronghold of the opposition against the current government of Rahman. And that they've been the government tries to bring this region into the government fold, but there's still a lot of resistance there. So this just goes to show, how difficult it is to really unify or consolidate these countries, whether you're talking about water resources, whether you're talking about these different mountainous regions. And then, of course, there's a long and porous border with Afghanistan as well. So really no shortage of geopolitical issues here that these countries are contending with.
Now, many Kyrgyz critics are of the view that Moscow has given a free hand to Tajikistan to do whatever it wishes to do. Would you agree with this kind of a statement?
Well, I think this does point to the fact that Russia is an influential country, as we've discussed, having a military presence and a lot of influence in other realms over these countries. But I don't see that Russia is necessarily having an interest in supporting one country over another. Ultimately, it's Russia's interest to have this region stabilized. As long as it remains out of, the fold of the West, or even out of other countries that are perhaps competing with Russia in this region, then it's not interested in supporting one country over the other or having these kinds of escalations. It just wants stability so that it can focus on other more problematic areas like Ukraine.
And Eugene, do you see a consistency of the political system of the two countries to thrive and prevail in times to come? Isn't it a fact that being away from democracy is increasing the problems for the people in this region?
Exactly, because a lot of these political systems largely mirror that of Russia, which are, highly centralized top-down systems where opposition is very difficult, or it's a lot of the time it's cracked down or muzzled. And ultimately, that does point to these countries' desire or these governments' desire for having stability. But there are a lot of challenges to that, which Russia is among the countries that's trying to prevent those from escalating.
Thank you very much, Eugene Chausovsky, for being guest in today's program.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Eugene Chausovsky has given an interesting insight of the problem. And one of the major reasons he believes this problem has escalated this far is perhaps the influence of Russia that he believes is diluting, if not completely subsiding over a period of time. My second guest to join me is again from Washington, D.C. His name is Wilder Calvin. He's analyst at Newsline Institute. He has served in the past at Washington Institute for Near East Policy Program. Welcome to the show, Mr. Wilder.
Thank you for having me.
Wilder Calvin, this is a long-running problem between the two sides, and we understand there are various dynamics of the issue. How do you see this issue between the two countries?
Right, absolutely. So as you mentioned, this is a long-running problem going back to 1992. So you have a shared border between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan that's about 950 kilometers long, and most of that is contested, or almost most of it at this point. So there's been recurring clashes over the years. But what's happened in this most recent round of fighting is the most intense that we've seen since these two countries got their independence in 1992. It's not totally clear how it got started, but it appears to have followed a similar pattern to what we've seen previously, as far as having a small skirmish between border guards on both sides that inflicted several casualties. But this time that spiraled into something much more serious. So you had artillery, tanks, and there's potentially some allegations of drones and other aircraft being used to hit positions that were actually much farther and deeper into Kyrgyz territory, at least this time.
A while ago, I was talking to Eugene Chausovsky, who said that water dispute plays an imperative role in this problem, or in escalating or aggravating this problem further. What's your take on it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the border area is contested, and it's not just the line of demarcation, but also how resources are allocated there that's been contested. So you have grazing land that's being used by agricultural communities, as well as farmland along that border, and how that's allocated has led to a lot of just sort of hyper-local disputes over the years. And a big part of that has to do with freshwater sources. So you have rivers that start on both sides of the border that flow into the other side, and communities on each side of the border oftentimes feel that too much water is being taken from the other side of the border. And so that leads to sort of high tensions on both sides. And then as you have these border guards that then are sort of involved in these disputes, that also creates the possibility of these disputes becoming nationalized and escalating, which has been sort of a recurring feature of this conflict.
Calvin, the timing of this event is also quite surprising for many people. Many believe that at this time, when most of the regional leaders were there in Central Asia, while this problem escalated between the two sides. Another important aspect in the same regard is the speed with which the dust has settled between the two sides within 48 hours. How do you comment on the timing of this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a lot of people asking why now and why was this round of fighting more intense if you've had serious or similar sort of clashes in the past that have been resolved without that level of escalation. So you have a few things happening right now. One thing is obviously that Russia is heavily distracted by the war in Ukraine. So there's potentially a perception on both sides that they have more space to escalate and to gain the upper hand along that border without Russia interfering. So there's been some reports that Russian troops that were previously deployed to Kyrgyzstan, for instance, were pulled back from Kyrgyzstan and potentially deployed to Ukraine several months ago. So that's potentially led Tajikistan to feel empowered and to take advantage of that. Another dynamic that you're seeing right now that's different from the past is that there's a lot of conversations about who's going to succeed Emomali Rahman in Tajikistan. So you have his young son, Rustam Emomali, pardon me. And so there's a sense that Emomali Rahman is potentially trying to consolidate and sort of leave an open field for his successor. And so that's led him to kind of be a little bit more aggressive, not just along the border in Kyrgyzstan, but also in the east in Gorno-Badakhshan, where there's been a really brutal crackdown. And these are sort of displays of strength that consolidate his power and make that transition to his son a little bit more streamlined.
Now, this gives birth to another question. As you rightly pointed out, Russia has certainly an important role in this region and its military has a lot of influence. But the same military then has a lot of influence in many other countries of Central Asia. How do you see Russia's military influence to go forward from this point on?
Yeah, absolutely. So Russia is generally seen as the leader of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, or the CSTO, which Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are both members of. So Russia is kind of seen as the dominant military actor in that region, as well as the dominant political actor. So historically, it's been seen as kind of the hegemon of this region. It definitely has the most military access, and it's also the largest supplier of military hardware to Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, although that's potentially been shifting in recent years. But yeah, like I said, there's been sort of recent events in Ukraine specifically that have pulled Russia's attention away and potentially left it in less of a dominant position and less of a capacity to sort of forcefully mediate between the two sides or effectively mediate. And you've also had sort of that dovetails with sort of broader trends as China has been also trying to get more militarily involved in the region and has actually been opening at least one military base in eastern Tajikistan as well, which has shifted those dynamics somewhat.
That's a very important point. And I'm sorry to cut you here. You just said that China has also developed a military base in Tajikistan. Tell us more about it. How do you think about China's interests in Tajikistan?
Yeah, absolutely. So this has been a relatively new development in recent years. China has opened a small military base in eastern Tajikistan in the Gorno-Badakhshan region, where Dushanbe has been involved in this crackdown since May. At this point, there's not a lot of details that are known about it. It was established before the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, and one possible reason was that China was interested in this was that they wanted to base those a little bit closer to Afghanistan at that point. But yeah, the details are not totally clear, and whether or not there's potential for expansion there is not totally clear. At this point, you're probably talking about a relatively small forward deployment and a not terribly developed base. But some people do think that could be a...
Calvin, it makes a lot of sense, but let's again focus on it. You just said Afghanistan has a lot of role or has an important role in this region. Do you believe that Afghanistan, after the withdrawal of United States from Afghanistan, still has an imperative role for other countries that are neighboring Afghanistan today?
Yeah, so when the U.S. had military forces there, that might have been part of the impetus for China wanting to open a base in Tajikistan and potentially keep tabs on that operation to some degree. But yeah, there's a lot that we don't know at this point about how things are going to play out in Afghanistan. I definitely would say that it's still a very important country with a lot of geopolitical significance, and certainly significance for Central Asia specifically, because if a power vacuum opens up there where non-state actors are able to operate, you could absolutely see that destabilizing the situation in Tajikistan or in any of the countries that border Afghanistan.
Now, Calvin, let's assume a scenario that with the prevailing war between Ukraine and Russia, which apparently seems to be another long war, suppose it makes Russia further weaker economically as well as politically. Now, in this case, what would be the consequences for other countries of Central Asian Republic?
Yeah, so like I said, I mean, even before the war in Ukraine, you had this conflict between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. So this isn't necessarily new. And it does look like Russia has been able to mediate to some effective degree, despite having its attention pulled elsewhere in Ukraine this time around. But yeah, certainly as Russia, I think that there's a general sense that Russia is having its attention pulled away, not just to Ukraine, but in general that it's being edged out by China and Central Asia. And there's a potential for instability there as that shift takes place. Absolutely.
And how appreciative are you of the fact that Russia was quite capable of diplomatically firefighting this event and handled it pretty quickly?
Yeah, so there's been ongoing talks since, I believe, 2012 between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan trying to resolve the underlying border dispute. And they haven't moved very much at this point. I think that there's been maybe 20 or 30 kilometers that they've actually formally settled through that process. But again, you've got about 400 kilometers of border that are still being actively contested between the two sides. So that underlying dispute is still there. I think negative peace might be a good term for that, as you said. Certainly the dramatic fighting, the artillery shelling, the use of tanks, that's been stopped. And that has been stopped quite effectively at this point. There's been several days of calm there. But there's this underlying dispute, and it's likely to lead to further clashes in the future. And those further clashes could, again, lead to more spiraling out of control like we saw.
Thank you very much, Wilder Calvin, for being guest in our program today.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed talking to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this was very insightful comments from Wilder Calvin, who is an analyst at Newsline Institute. And let's add my third guest in the same session. He's Mohammad Taimur Khan from ISSI, a think tank based in Islamabad. Taimur, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Taimur, a while ago, I had Mr. Calvin in the show, and you might have heard what he just said. Do you agree with his statement about Russia's role in Central Asian republics?
Well, I completely agree with Mr. Wilder because the waning off of Russian influence in the Central Asian republics is also being reflected in other parts or neighborhoods of Russia as well, particularly in the South Caucasus region, where Armenia and Azerbaijan are also at loggerheads with each other, and both of them are ex-Soviet states with good relations with Russia, economic, military and political relations with Russia, but even those countries are also slowly and gradually drifting out of the Russian influence. So I think this is exactly what is happening inside of the Central Asian republics as well, especially with regards to the global, in the global context, as you see that Russia is completely and predominantly engaged in its Ukraine war, and all of its political, military and economic attention and resources are being consumed by that war. So the other countries that were under the Russian influence or under the sphere of Russian influence, they are slowly and gradually trying to make moves in order to incrementally get out of that sphere of influence and create opportunities for themselves in other parts of the world as well. So I completely agree with Mr. Wilder that yes, the Russian power inside of the Central Asian republics and in other parts of its neighborhood is waning slowly and gradually.
But Taimur, there must be other underlying issues. There might be other issues underneath this entire problem. It might just not be what we just said. So what are the other dimensions or dynamics of this issue?
Well, that is totally true, because the thing is that there were several underlying issues in all the ex-Soviet states after they gained independence in 1991, after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, such as there were border disputes, there were water sharing disputes, so on and so forth. But those issues were, not that much prominent when they were all in the dominion of the USSR. But after the disintegration of the USSR in 1991, as I mentioned earlier, those issues came to the forefront. mainly because of the political rhetorics that are currently brewing up inside of the local politics of each of these individual countries that are in the Russian neighborhood. You can say that the issue of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, it has also to do a lot with the political rhetoric that is currently going on in both these countries. In Tajikistan, the government of President Rahman, it is slowly and gradually transferring his power to his son. And for that, he needs to show some power and strength in his family so that he could make his people believe that yes, his family is the right choice for their for the leadership of their country. On the other hand, the new government in Kyrgyzstan is also very nationalistic in nature, and the head of their National Security Council, as of late, has been making a lot of nationalistic statements in order to bruise support for its new government. So it is also, this current conflict has a lot to do with the current political rhetoric that is undergoing in both these countries at the moment. So yes, as the politics in these countries is advancing, so are the issues that are being more strongly being manifested among them, and the conflicts and the issues existing between these countries are getting more and more pronounced with every passing year.
Taimur, what I meant to say is that Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan have some other issues as well, as we have discussed, porous borders and water, but what else can be the issues that have exacerbated the problem between the two sides?
Well, if you want an answer for that, you'll have to go into the history of both these countries, which were part of the Soviet Union back in the last century. You see, the borders or the area or the demarcation of these regions of the Soviet Union, they were drawn by Soviet map makers, and they were very much blurry. Blurry in the sense that they were drawn regardless of seeing the demographics of these regions, and they were completely drawn keeping in mind the political motives in mind. So the borders of these regions were drawn back during the Stalin era, back in the 1920s and 1930s. The underlying problem, the main problem between these countries right now is that of water sharing and the undemarcated boundary lines of these two countries. Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, they share a border which is almost 1,000 kilometers, and 1/3 of that border, approximately 471 kilometers of that border, is unmarked. So you can see how it is, how it provides the space for escalation and arousal of issues. The second major important point of conflict between these two countries is the water sharing. Both these countries are upper riparian countries, and both of them are also water scarce countries as well, because the impacts of climate change are also impacting the Central Asian republics as well. So both these countries are trying to create more and more reservoirs and gain more and more control over the water tributaries that are crossing through the mainland of both these countries. So water sharing disputes and the undemarcation of the boundary line are the two major issues between these two countries.
That's a good point. And that brings us to another important question. Let's suppose, going forward, if Russia loses further military influence, or Russia loses its grip on Ukraine, will it not increase the chances of Russia using weapons of mass destruction or resorting for heavier weaponry? Because it's like a suicide for Russia not to opt for more weapons and lose the war politely or silently.
Well, of course, the more control Russia loses over its periphery, the more hostile one can expect Russia might get, especially under the leadership that it is currently under. But the more important point to think of is that currently Russia is acting as a, you can say, the security guarantor in the region and keeping a lot of issues and escalation under control. So if Russia significantly loses its control in its periphery, we might see that more turmoil and more chaos will ensue in this part of the world, which will again embroil the region and the world at large in more catastrophes and in more waves of terrorism, militancy, and wars. So for me, I see a very ominous picture that if Russia continues to lose its control over its periphery, the area is going to get embroiled in more and more trouble and chaos.
Very interesting. But Taimur, that brings us to another important question. Tell me if you believe Russia's hard power is more assertive in the region, or you also are appreciative of the soft power that Russia has in this region.
Well, I think as far as the Armenia-Azerbaijan issue is concerned, I think it will subside because again, the international context is very, very important. I cannot say the same about Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan issue that might escalate in the coming future, in the near future. But the issue of Armenia and Azerbaijan, I foresee in the near future that it will subside and get resolved. The reason being is that a lot of economic and strategic interests of regional and extra-regional powers have developed with Azerbaijan. And you could have seen how different regional and extra-regional powers supported supported Azerbaijan during its conflict with Armenia. The main point being is that European Union is currently facing an energy crisis, and it requires to fill the gap that the Russian sanctions against the Russian energy has left in the European market. So European Union needs Azerbaijani energy, especially that it is extracting from the Caspian Sea reserves. So for that, European Union wants amicable situation or peaceful situation in the South Caucasus region, and that is why it is continuously creating platforms for Armenia and Azerbaijan to resolve their issues amicably, and even trying to convince the Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan to reach a compromise with Azerbaijan, which can actually ensure that all the energy reserves of Azerbaijan are amicably and peacefully transported to the European markets and create a win-win situation for everyone. Russia, on the other hand, has also remained considerably silent when it comes to Armenia-Azerbaijan issue, despite hashing out some political statements of peace and tranquility in this regard. But for the majority of it, it has sided with Azerbaijan, despite the constant appeals of the Armenian government and the calling of the Article 5 or Article 4 of the CSTO agreement, which calls for collective security. But Russia never responded to that. So I think that when global major powers have interest in the peaceful resolution of Armenia-Azerbaijan issue, I think the issue is going to get resolved and subside eventually.
Taimur, you have drawn a line between the issue of Armenia and Azerbaijan and the issue that we have in hand at the moment. Now, do you believe this issue will subside, or you think it will re-escalate over and over with a period, with some more time?
Well, for the most part, I think it was right till last century at least. Russia was maintaining its influence through its hard power, but there are certain elements or a small percentage of Russian soft power which was not deliberate, but it still exists inside of its periphery. You have to understand that when during the Stalin era, when Russia got control of these different regions or extended its Iron Curtain into Central Asia, into South Caucasus, North Ossetia, South Ossetia, it carried out a complete social re-engineering of these regions by transforming their language, their culture, their architecture, their literature. So implicitly, it did influence their culture and their society by incorporating its own culture, its own language, and its own Russian or Slavic idiosyncrasy into these countries as well, which actually manifested its own soft power into this region, which still exists because majority of the populations of these regions or countries, they speak and understand Russian. They still have economic and political and strategic interests with Russia. They still host a lot of Russian economic interests in their country, besides the other hard power elements that already exist in those countries, such as military bases, joint military exercises, so on and so forth. But yes, there is a small element of Russian soft power that exists in its periphery as well, because of its language, because of its cultural and historical similarities.
Now, how concerned can China be in this regard? We have just heard from our previous guest that China has an increasing interest in the Central Asian republics. How much of a concern do you believe this is for China if the problems prevail further in the Central Asian republics?
Well, of course, because China is not only a regional power, it has manifested itself as a global power now. And as you are aware that both Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, they share borders with China's restive region of Xinjiang. There are serious concerns within China with regards to trouble in Central Asia, particularly the Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan issue, because in China's Xinjiang there is an element of militancy as well, which sprouts from the Central Asian region and manifests itself in the Chinese Xinjiang region, with which China has had a very bad experience in the last few years. And China is afraid that if the situation inside of Central Asia erupts, it will have its spillover effects inside of the restive Chinese region of Xinjiang as well. This is one point. The second concern of China with regard to Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan issue is its BRI, its tentacles, its western tentacles of BRI that it is extending from its western borders towards Central Asia. Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan are houses to different tributaries of the Belt and Road Initiative that is initiating from the Chinese mainland, and they are passing through these two Central Asian countries. So if there is trouble or militancy or chaos or escalation in these two countries, the Chinese economic and strategic interests will also be harmed, and that is why the concern of Chinese with regards to this issue are very much pronounced.
Thank you very much, Taimur. Please stay online. Don't leave. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and we'll join you back with the second segment of the program where Taimur remains to be our guest. Stay with us. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. As you understand, the 77th session of UNGA is in progress since 13th of September. And just yesterday, Prime Minister of Pakistan, Mir Mohammad Shahbaz Sharif, spoke to the occasion. Now, there's some important points that he spoke about. First and foremost part of his speech was to draw the attention of international community toward the larger problem of climate change and its consequence impact that Pakistan has faced, which has catastrophically devastated Pakistan's infrastructure. Also, he spoke about some other issues like the issue of Kashmir, the issue of Afghanistan, and the spillover effect of terrorism from Afghanistan into the neighboring Pakistan. He also reminded the global community of Pakistan's consistent concerns about the issue of Islamophobia. Taimur, as you have heard these speeches, tell me, what exactly do you see with regards to the timing of this event? We had the floods, then the visit of Secretary General of United Nations to Pakistan, and right after that we have this UNGA where Pakistan's Prime Minister is representing the country. How do you see this development?
Well, the timing of this event is of utmost significance because right after the devastating floods that wreaked havoc in our country, this important United Nations General Assembly session took place where Pakistan was able to present its case and highlight all the devastation and all the economic and humanitarian losses that Pakistan has suffered at the hands of the climate crisis, that has manifested itself in the central and southern parts of Pakistan, which has, internally displaced millions of people of Pakistan, as well as incurred more than $30 billion worth of destruction in the country. And I think our Prime Minister's presence and especially our Foreign Minister's meetings at the sidelines of the UNGA session, I think they were very important in highlighting Pakistan's plea and Pakistan's request to the international community in order to take some pertinent, important steps on priority basis in order to mitigate the impacts of climate change of which Pakistan was a victim.
And Taimur, given all the circumstances that we are facing as a nation, given the fact that he spoke about the issues of climate change, the issues that we just underlined, how timely was, again, this speech with regards to Pakistan?
Well, I think it was highly important because, as you must be aware, that the entire conversation during the UNGA summit, the UNGA session was actually profoundly preoccupied by issues of strategic nature, such as the Ukraine war, the high inflation in different parts of the world, food security, the energy security, but nobody was raising the pertinent issue, the most important peril to humanity, which is the climate change. Nobody was addressing that, but our Prime Minister timely raised this issue at the onset of his speech at the UNGA session and told the world that, the other strategic issues are important and needs to be addressed, but this does not warrant that important issues like climate change and its resultant climate injustice that is taking place. And I think the Prime Minister very rightly pointed out and highlighted all those important issues with regards to climate change. And it is important to note here that our Prime Minister also raised this issue during, earlier last week when the SEO summit also took place. The climate change was the issue that he was the only one who raised it significantly in his speech during that SEO summit as well. So I think our Prime Minister was right on the spot when he raised this issue during his speech at the UNGA session.
Tamuri also pointed out the issue of Kashmir and reminded United Nations of the commitments that UN has made from the people of Kashmir. How do you see this?
Well, I think again, the Prime Minister very rightly pointed out to all those pertinent issues that the world was currently, not ignoring per se, but they were not highlighting it to the extent that these issues were supposed to be highlighted. As you are aware that the United States President in his speech also raised the issue of expansion of the UN Security Council, and he talked about the Ukraine war a lot. But at the same time, he I think he failed to mention the atrocities that India was committing against its own minorities, particularly the Muslims of Jammu and Kashmir, and how it was manifesting the demographic change in the Muslim majority state of Kashmir, and how unilaterally it violated rules of international law, and and it has unleashed a reign of terror in the illegally occupied territory of Jammu and Kashmir. So I think the Prime Minister very rightly pointed out to the world that while on the one hand people are extremely preoccupied with the Ukraine war, but they are ignoring what India is doing simultaneously in its own mainland against the Muslim minorities as well as the Muslim majority in the disputed territory of Jammu and Kashmir. But it is also very important that Prime Minister not only highlighted what Indian atrocities are in Kashmir and inside of the Indian mainland about regarding its minorities, he specifically made it a point to state that Pakistan is not looking for war or conflict, but Pakistan is looking for amicable, workable political relationship with all its neighbors, particularly India. And then with regards to Afghanistan, he also pointed out that while the issue of terrorism is still a pinching thorn on the Afghan side and for the rest of the international community, but it is also important to release the frozen assets of Afghanistan in order to enable its interim governance setup to hash out some good governance in the country so that people don't fall for the menace of extremism and terrorism. So I think our Prime Minister's speech was very up to the point and was very important in this regard.
Not only that, but he also spoke about the issue of Afghanistan at large. And with regards to Afghanistan, then he also pointed out that Afghanistan's is causing spillover effect of terrorism in Pakistan. There are many things that are now being caused by the economic destruction of Afghan economy. So how would you comment on Prime Minister prioritizing the issue of Afghanistan in the UNGA?
Yeah, of course, it is very important because, as I mentioned earlier, that the world is profoundly preoccupied with the other issues that are manifesting themselves in the rest of the world, such as the Ukraine war. But in the meantime, the world is ignoring the ticking time bomb that is currently in Afghanistan, the menace of international terrorism. And once again, if the world keeps on ignoring, especially the major global powers like the United States of America and the European powers, if they continue to ignore this ticking bomb in Afghanistan with regards to the international terrorism that is again finding safe haven, and it is again rejuvenating itself, carrying out multiple attacks and targeting civilians inside of Afghanistan, if they continue to ignore this menace, I think we will once again be encountered with a Frankenstein, which is once again is going to embroil the entire region in its fold and going to unleash another wave of terrorism from which this region has suffered for the last more than 2 decades. So I think it was very I can say visionary or at least insightful of our Prime Minister to highlight that issue at the UNGA session as well, that while other conflicts are also important and needs to be addressed, but the world just cannot ignore what is happening inside of Afghanistan as well.
Taimur, last time when Pakistan was represented in UNGA by former Prime Minister Imran Khan, Pakistan had pointed out the concerns with regards to the issue of Islamophobia. Now this time another government is in charge. A different set of parties has brought or has mandated the current Prime Minister of Pakistan, Mia Mohammad Shahbaz Sharif. And there is a lot of political how can I say that? There is a lot of political dispute between the two sides as well. But despite that, Pakistan has once again brought the issue of Islamophobia at the forefront. Does it not show Pakistan's consistent interest or consistent focus on the issue of Islamophobia?
Of course, because Mr. Shabbat, one thing we need to realize is that the issues that our prime ministers raise at such important international forums are beyond the local politics of our country. Those issues are important for our national security and our national foreign policy goals as well, and for the international peace and security at large. And that is why the issue of Islamophobia was rightly raised by our Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif at this year's UNGA session, and by our former Prime Minister Imran Khan during previous sessions of the UNGA as well, because the Islamophobia is a reality now. It is manifesting itself in different parts of the world, particularly inside of India, which is our next door neighbor, but as well as in America and in the European Union as well. One can expect the rise of Islamophobia for different reasons, such as political and economic reasons inside of India, and the overwhelming popularity or the populism wave of Hindutva inside of India. But it is a shock that Islamophobia is on the rise inside of Western liberal democracies like the United States of America and the European Union. So it was very important that Pakistan, being one of the major Muslim countries of the world, raised this issue on the international forum as well.
Absolutely. And also the United States President Joe Biden spoke about the climate change issue and its catastrophic impact that Pakistan has faced, unfortunately. Isn't it a surprise for Pakistan? Isn't it something that we were actually not expecting?
Well, I see it very encouragingly. Because when a global leader like President Joe Biden, when he specifically mentioned Pakistan and the problems that Pakistan has been facing and experiencing at the hands of the impacts of climate change, I think this will definitely put the issues of climate change at the forefront of global issues, and will also highlight this issue in front of the global community, and also get it treated as a priority issue in international affairs. So I think his mention of Pakistan and the impacts of climate change in that regard is definitely going to bring out some genuine international attention to this issue.
And Taimur, what other developments in UNGA are a point of attention for independent researchers who are looking at this as a major diplomatic event?
First of all, again, the international issue such as the Ukraine war was extremely important during this UNGA session, with different global powers such as the United States of America, China, Russia, and the European partners of America such as Germany, England, France. They were extremely focused on what was going on in the Ukraine issue and its resultant other global problems that have arisen, such as the global food crisis, the energy shortage, the price hikes, the disruption of global supply chains. But I was happy to see that how all the countries reiterated that there is a need to resolve the issues amicably through negotiations and diplomacy, and there is no room for warfare. So it was very encouraging for me. Plus, what actually stood out for me was the activities of our young Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto Zardari. The meetings that he undertook at the sidelines of the UNGA session, like he chaired the G77 countries session, thanked all the countries which reached out to Pakistan regarding the aid in order to rehabilitate and deal with the consequences of the devastating floods in our country. Plus, he organized the Young Foreign Ministers meeting, in which he hosted the young foreign ministers of different UNGA member countries and exchanged views with them, which was actually a very positive development in my regard, that finally, the baton of foreign policy charge was, it seemed like the baton of for me, it seemed like the baton of control, or at least main policy making, was being shifted from an older generation to a younger generation. So I think this year's UNGA session had a lot of positive developments, especially these and among others.
Thank you very much, Taimur, for being guest in our program.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the 77th session of UNGA continues in United Nations. Pakistan has again reminded the world of the commitments that have been made on the issue of Afghanistan, on the issue of Kashmir. Also, Pakistan reminded of the catastrophe that Pakistan is facing due to the criminal negligence by all other countries that are heavily contributing to the global carbon emission. Let's hope this helps Pakistan to draw the attention of these international powers and help us out of this hour of crisis. We'll join you tomorrow again with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.